Good afternoon. My name is Diana Phillip with NARAL Pro-Choice Maryland. Today we are having a webinar, a conversation about disability rights and reproductive rights. And now I'm going to introduce one of our interns, Marian, who's been working with us this fall on these issues, and then she's going to introduce our guest speaker today as well. Marian, take it away.
Hi, my name is Marian. I'm a fall intern this semester with NARAL, and I'm a women's studies major at the University of Maryland College Park. And I've been working on issues related to disability and reproductive rights and justice this semester. And I've had the pleasure to speak with our guest today, Munib Lohrasbi, 2 times, I think, through professional development and through my own interests in this area. And Munib is joining us from Disability Rights Maryland as a human rights attorney, and we'll be discussing kind of broadly disability and reproductive rights and justice from kind of some background framing of the research that I've been doing this semester in my class and in this internship, and then we'll let Munib kind of dive us into the specific conversation around disability, mental illness, prison, human rights violations, and kind of at the framing at the beginning, considering how these issues are also reproductive justice issues. So I guess to begin, I'll just do a little bit of framing, and then we'll get into some questions with Munib, if that sounds good. For me, I have been really interested in this framing of disability and reproductive justice, especially within this human rights framework and within centering marginalized populations, and which is why I'm especially interested in this intersection with mental illness, criminalization, and human rights violations of Munib's work. And I believe that both the disability issues and centering principles of autonomy, dignity, and justice. And as I see this conversation relate to reproductive rights and justice, I also consider this, well, criminalization of mental health, as Munib will talk about, as well as criminalization of trauma, criminalization of pregnancy, and the disproportionate rates of disabled pregnant women who are incarcerated, and kind of these structural issues that are at play with accessibility issues, stigma, discrimination, and devaluation of mental illness and disabled bodies. And also kind of centering this conversation within social services expansion and kind of what community initiatives or alternatives are available. And kind of with that, I would just like to turn things over to Munib and just kind of begin by sharing a little bit about your work at Disability Rights Maryland and what a human rights attorney does within the context of prison and disability.
Great, thank you so much for that setup, Marian. And thanks to NARAL Pro-Choice Maryland for having me, and for all of you for taking the time to hear us out on these important issues and to learn more about what's happening within our criminal justice system. First, just a little bit of background on me and Disability Rights Maryland. DRM is what's called the Protection and Advocacy Agency for Maryland. The federal Congress required back in the 70s that every state needed to establish one of these agencies, first and foremost as a monitoring and advocacy agency, right? So Congress gave these PNAs extremely broad access authority to go into any facility in the state that provides services to folks with disabilities. So that obviously includes prisons, but also schools, hospitals, literally any kind of facility that you can imagine that provides these services. But the reason that I feel so strongly about this work and that PNA should be involved in prison is because of just the basic transparency that doesn't exist in those facilities, right? With schools and hospitals, what have you, you've got folks that are just walking in and out every day who have cell phones, who can talk to the service recipients, and there's just a different level of access. that requires a little bit more transparency with those facilities. But with prisons, wardens and departments of corrections are fully entitled to tell folks off the street that they're denied access, right? So we wind up as a society really relying on department administrators and wardens for a lot of the information, which I personally don't think is a good method, right? I think it's always best to go directly to the folks with the lived experience who are the ones living within those conditions on a day-to-day basis. So that's, I guess, what drew me towards this, um, intersection, I guess, of working with the PNA and in prisons. From a disability rights perspective, the main focus of my work is the use of what we call restrictive housing. So that's going to be any sort of housing status that keeps folks confined to their cell for 22 hours or more per day. There are three main types that are used in Maryland prison facilities. First is the traditional disciplinary segregation, is what they call it, which is for folks who've committed a disciplinary infraction, right? Who have violated a prison rule, have been found guilty, and are given a set number of days to serve. The second type is administrative segregation, which is really very similar. In fact, a lot of facilities, they mix those two statuses together. You're allowed to have a little bit more personal property in administrative seg, but this is used for folks who have just been accused of an infraction and are awaiting their hearing, or the matter's under investigation. They could be awaiting transfer to a different facility. It could be for protective purposes. It's really sort of a catch-all. But the reason that we find it problematic, beyond obviously the conditions themselves, but administrative seg can be uncapped, right? Disciplinary, as I mentioned, you're going in for 30, 45, 60 days, whatever the sanction may be. Ad seg is indefinite, right? And we've definitely met folks who've been in ad seg for months, if not years. Sometimes just awaiting that elusive facility transfer, which may or may not happen. Or, like I said, they could be under investigation. And we've had folks who have been transferred from one facility to the next and are still under investigation in that original facility. And no one at the new facility even knows why they're being investigated or knows what the underlying matter is. And meanwhile, that person is just, languishing and deteriorating in seg. The third use of restrictive housing is probably the most troubling to us, even though they're all fairly troubling, but it's the use of restrictive housing for healthcare purposes, both mental health and somatic. And before I get into the specific conditions in each of these types of restrictive housing, I want to talk a bit about the harm, right? Because that's obviously going to be the underlying theme and the main reason why we think it's so terrible and needs to be eliminated. But it's really a consensus of research that says that this is a harmful practice. This is not something that where there are two competing sides. All the science really will say flat out that restrictive housing, this sort of isolation and removal from any sort of social networks, removal from human interaction, even if you have a cellmate in there with you, can be harmful, right? If you're going in even without a mental health diagnosis, symptoms like paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations, and even worst case self-harming behaviors start to become more prevalent, right? So that's an issue for anyone, right? But the population that's at the greatest risk of harm from these, I don't want to say side effects, but the impact really are folks with serious mental illness. Which, as you can imagine, are folks who have pre-existing issues, folks who are schizophrenic, folks who are already having hallucinations and are already having a lot of these issues, will see those symptoms become exacerbated. And the deterioration will happen more quickly with them than with other folks, generally speaking. So as I said, this is something that's recognized by a consensus of researchers, by organizations like the American Psychiatric Association, World Health Organization, even the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare. So, the prison officials themselves will say that, they can't really make the argument that it's not harmful, right? Their argument tends to be that correctional interests and safety tend to outweigh any harm that's caused by restrictive housing, which I think is ridiculous. And is also a myth, right? Because plenty of states, not Maryland, unfortunately, to the extent that we would want, but plenty of states have passed real legitimate limitations on the use of restrictive housing, and they've all seen violent infractions either stay flat or go down. Not a single one of these jurisdictions has seen violent infractions go up. So it's really a myth that this practice, restrictive housing, is some sort of a necessary safety tool. But anyway, going back to the specifics of how restrictive housing is used in Maryland, I mentioned it's also used for healthcare purposes. Most infirmaries, each facility has an infirmary, which is kind of like a hospital within the prison, where folks are able to receive more medical attention, but they're also much, much more confined, right? So this infirmary also exists in the women's prison, MCIW, which is out in Jessup. Maryland only has one prison for women, and it's in the teens for men. So, with the men, you'll have like minimum, medium, high security prisons, whereas with women, they're all in one facility, all sorts of classifications. But anyway, the MCIW's infirmary is where they send pregnant women during their third trimesters. Um, uh, so obviously, it's a restrictive housing unit, which is what I'm getting at. But on top of all that, you're also removed from any sort of programming or jobs that you may have been involved with. So this is problematic because once you come out of the infirmary, you're not automatically placed back in those same programming or job opportunities. You're placed at the bottom of waiting lists. And in prison, jobs and desirable jobs and any programming is extremely rare. Um, so those waiting lists can take months or years to get through, especially for the more desirable opportunities. For jobs, you're going to have to, if you were working, at administrative or in the kitchens or something like that, you typically we're going to have to start with a maintenance job and work your way back up, all as a result of being pregnant, right? So on top of all the harmful conditions that we think exist during the actual infirmary stay, there are also these collateral consequences, right? So jobs, programs, and even your housing placement, right? You could, prison can be a very lonely place, right? You're obviously not with your family, your friends, folks on the outside. So the relationships that the women are able to build inside take on heightened importance, right? Just the shared common experiences and just being there with someone else and able to talk, those bonds tend to form. And again, through no fault of their own, pregnant women are removed from these environments where, in theory, they were doing just fine for the first two trimesters. And then for that third trimester, they're removed from that. And then once, hopefully, they have a healthy, successful, birth of the child, there's no guarantee that they're returned to that same housing unit. They might be able to if there's a bed available and if the stars sort of align, but they can be sent anywhere, right? And then you're kind of just starting from scratch. Again, DRM, we think that this is inappropriate across the board for any purpose, disciplinary, administrative, whatever. But I do think it's especially egregious when you're talking about this happening for any sort of a medical reason, but of course, pregnancy being included within that. So that was sort of how my work sort of intersected with the work of NARAL Pro-Choice Maryland's, and with the tremendous advocacy of this group and many other advocates. There was some success in passing a bill during the 2019 session of the General Assembly limiting the use of restrictive housing for pregnant women, which is tremendous. It's definitely a good thing. I don't mean to minimize that at all, but what we're seeing is that pregnant women are still being sent to the infirmary. They're just being let out for a little bit more than 2 hours a day, right? So they're not technically meeting that threshold for restrictive housing, which is 22 hours or more per day. So the infirmary itself it's what you would think, right? It's a unit dedicated for somatic care, but women often, not all the time, but often are actually solitary. There are like solitary cells there. So you don't even get the benefit of that cellmate, which can exist in these other restrictive housing units. Recreation is done indoors. There's no outdoor recreation for women or anyone in the infirmary, even in the men's facilities, right? So the recreation that they do get, it's really just wandering around the halls of the infirmary. It's not like there's like, an activity room or stuff for them to do other than mingle and talk to others, which is good, but it's still less recreation than they would get in population. Where there's a courtyard, you're able to talk to women from other units, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see, and also the other thing about the infirmary is that access to commissary is limited. So in prison, as you can imagine, you're getting there's a set menu of what the meal is for the day, for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and you receive it at very specific times. You can't just like decide when you want to have breakfast, lunch, dinner. And they're pretty early. I think lunch is served at like 10:30, dinner's at like 4:30. So you have to eat that. So the only way to kind of eat at a different time or supplement your diet beyond what those preset menu items are is through commissary, which again we think is problematic just because the women are having to pay for that out of pocket, and a lot of incarcerated women simply don't have those resources, um, which is not great. But even for women who do have those resources, they're not able to supplement their diet through commissary while they're in the infirmary, right? So, I've never been pregnant, but the way I understand it works is there are cravings for particular foods at odd times, perhaps. Um, and again, while you're able to access that for the first 2 trimesters of your pregnancy, the last one where again, presumably all of the stuff is becoming a little bit more heightened, that access is cut off. Now, since these issues have been raised, MCIW has started to provide these little like snack packs. It's basically like a baggie with a couple snacks in it for the pregnant women, but it's still not stuff that they're able to choose. And it might just be like an apple or something like that, which obviously it's good that it's something beyond what the preset meal is, but it is limiting the options of the women compared to what they would be receiving out in population. So um, part of what the bill that got passed in 2019 called for was also for individualized assessments, right? Because I mean, I do think obviously there are going to be some women, particularly those who are having high risk pregnancies, who might actually benefit from being in the infirmary and receiving that extra level of care. But it was just important for us that that's being determined on a case by case basis, right? We're not having a blanket rule where we're restricting a lot of these liberties that the women are relying on when they might be perfectly fine in population, right? Which I would think would be a significant portion of them. So really, that's what we want, is to make sure that this isn't happening unless it's absolutely necessary. And if so, for as short a period of time, as necessary to address the issue at hand. So yeah, so that's the infirmary and how it works for pregnant women who are incarcerated. I just wanted to touch on one other unit that's used where restrictive housing is used, and that's the mental health units. Um, and these are ostensibly designed for short-term stays, 72 hours or less, for folks who are experiencing behavioral health crises or actively suicidal. The idea is just to get them in and out. But what we've seen is while that may be true the majority of the time, there are definitely, in every single facility we visited, there are at least a couple of outliers who have been in there for months at a time, if not for years, right? And this is actually the most restrictive housing status in any prison for any reason whatsoever, more so than disciplinary, more so than the infirmary. Um, and it's, again, for folks who are experiencing behavioral health crises, suicidal, who are in such a low, deprived state that they're, exhibiting these symptoms. And just logically, right, if someone is feeling like that and is in that low of a place, taking away freedoms and restricting them even further just, is illogical, right? And obviously leads to um, those feelings and behaviors, frankly, being heightened, right? So we've interviewed plenty of people who've told us that they've lied either about being suicidal in the first place to avoid going to this unit, or once they're there lying about no longer being suicidal just to get themselves out. Um, these units, you are completely solitary there. There's no cellmate in here. They take away all of your clothes and personal property. So that includes underwear in the winters, and particularly for women, where There may be male COs. I've walked through these units in the women's facility with no sort of, extra layer of clothing or privacy provided to them. They're just given these suicide smocks, is what they're called, which is a smock, but it's made out of material that's too thick to tear or tie up into knots. But again, they're not giving any sort of underwear. In the winter, they're not given like coats or blankets or anything. Excuse me. The only two things that are in the cell is a steel metal bed frame, no mattress, no pillow, anything like that. Those are amenities that you have to quote unquote earn with good behavior. And then a little contraption that's like a sink toilet combination. They're connected together. But that's it. That's really all you have. You're not allowed to have any books, no writing materials, coloring pencils or sheets or anything like that. Meals are eaten in cell with your hands or your fingers because utensils are not allowed. In recreation is only offered for 15 minutes a day, 1-5, which is juxtaposed to an hour, which you receive in disciplinary or administrative segregation. And the roughly a little bit over 2 hours is we're receiving in the infirmaries now. So again, the least amount of out of cell time is for this population, which I think is wild. That that would be their conclusion, But even that recreation for 15 minutes is done indoors in like a little room that's like across the hallway from their original cells. A couple of them have TVs. I have never seen a TV in there that works. A couple of them have had like checkerboards, but no checker pieces because that can be a safety risk. So it's really like I'm using the term recreation very loosely, right? It's even that is not really the out of cell time that we had envisioned. And then the last thing I wanted to note is that they are able to apply 5-point restraints in this unit. So that's going to be all four, arms, legs, and then also around your neck as well. And in prison, they're allowed to apply both physical restraints and chemical restraints, like a chemical sedative, which is not legal in any sort other setting in Maryland, right? Like it's got to be one or the other. Another difference too is that the restraints can be applied for up to 4 hours at a time, whether you calm down or not. So if I'm just, I'm having a behavioral health crisis, I'm, spitting on people, yelling, et cetera, they can apply those restraints. And if I calm down after 5 minutes, unless the doctor gives that order, they're allowed to keep me under those restraints for a full 4 hours. And they have to keep records of this stuff, which I've reviewed through the course of our work, and I've never seen a single person let out of these restraints a minute before 4 hours is up. So that again is different from state hospitals. State hospitals where restraints are applied, they're legally required to take you off the restraints the minute that you calm down and you are no longer presenting that same sort of quote unquote safety risk as you had been. So in theory, this is stuff that all could be done to pregnant women as well, right? Pregnant women who are experiencing mental health issues who are locked up while they're pregnant, right? They don't have access to support systems, right? They don't have access to the potential father, to all of these things that would help with that process, right? And also women who are dealing with mental health issues postpartum as well, right? Once you have your child, you lose the child, right? Like the child doesn't come into the facility with you. So MCIW does have a room that they call a nursery, where newborn mothers are allowed to have contact visits with their infants, but that's for the visit, right? And once the visit's over, it's gone. And you got to go back to your cell and the prison life, which, obviously would be a problem for anyone, but for new mothers, I'm sure that's a particularly heartbreaking experience to have to let go of your child. And that's just for moms who, do have supports on the outside who are bringing the kid in, right? For a lot of the time, those visits aren't even happening in the first place. That certainly is a concern with both pregnant women and women who are postpartum, winding up in these behavioral health crisis units, and being subject to these conditions, which again, it's our position, of course, that it's through no fault of their own. It's as a result of underlying mental health issues and the facilities not providing adequate treatment or care. Again, I could talk about this stuff for hours, but I'll stop just because I know that We only have an hour here, and I want to be respectful of folks' times. I also just wanted to shift gears real quick before, I see if there are any questions about the decriminalization work, right? Because while the prison stuff is definitely my focus, I am DRM and me in particular, we're trying to expand our efforts on the decriminalization fronts because it's really preventative work, right? A lot of the folks that we work with in prison, we believe certainly that they're locked up as a consequence of their mental health, right? They're not getting proper medication, services on the outside. There's an incident as a result of that, and the first response always is to call 911, right? As a society, we're trained, from the time we're babies that you see any sort of a commotion, whether it's criminal or not, you call 911, right? There's a car accident. There's someone experiencing homelessness, peeing behind a dumpster. We call 911. That's just how we're programmed. Um, and so invariably, when you do that, cops show up, right? Cops who have guns, cops who are in uniform and are easily identifiable, and cops who have the power to incarcerate someone and take away fundamental freedoms and liberties, right? So when the cop shows up in that very easily identifiable uniform, that's the first obvious, reaction that people think, even in a behavioral health crisis, I recognize police, right? I recognize gun. I recognize potential for loss of freedom, right? Um, and police, I understand that the BPD and police generally is trying to institute training efforts and make sure that their officers know how to handle these situations, but it winds up being maybe a day or two worth of training, if that, right? Um, so it's just simply inadequate. It's simply inadequate for the job that they're being asked to do. They show up and frankly, even with that training, have no idea how to communicate, don't really know how to navigate the situation. The person on the other side of the interaction, as I mentioned, recognizes police and have a heightened sense of awareness to that, I guess, for lack of a better term. And it's easy to see how these situations can escalate and have negative outcomes, which can be incarceration, of course, but can also be worse than that, right? Can result in real physical harm, if not death. So again, it's our position that this is not through any fault of the person with the mental illness, right? It's just that like the person is showing up, is throwing gasoline on the fire, right? So ideally, right, if we were able to send someone as a first responder who is not a police officer, who is not in uniform, does not have a gun, does not have the power to incarcerate, maybe is someone community based, right? Someone that the person might recognize and have a sense of familiarity with. Like, oh, there's Marian. Like I know her from down the street. I know that she's a nice, gentle person that is easy to talk to, right? Instead of someone with a gun. Also, someone preferably with training, right? With professional training, not just a day or two, but with a degree in this stuff. Maybe a social worker, maybe a housing, a specialist that can connect someone with resources. Obviously it'll vary on a case by case basis, but having the ability and infrastructure as a city or whatever jurisdiction we're talking about, Baltimore or otherwise, to be able to respond in a more specialized manner, right? That's more appropriate. So in our opinion, that would also require a dispatch system that is, similar to 911, but separate from law enforcement. So running parallel to that, with again dispatchers who are trained to recognize which sort of response is appropriate for the situation, right? If you get a call in about a homicide, okay, maybe we can send police, right? But if we have a call about some man running down the street screaming without any pants on, maybe that's when we send in a counselor and a trained professional instead of someone with a cop, someone with a gun. And again, I think that's really preventative for the work that I do, right? I don't want to say all or a majority, I don't want to put a number on it, but a significant number of my clients, when you're looking at their records and what got them locked up in the first place, it's something that I certainly could see being nipped in the bud if they were receiving proper services and care on the outside, and also whoever called the cops on them had maybe recognized a more appropriate response to the situation. So yeah, that's kind of a I don't want to say a quick summary of the work because I've been talking for half an hour, but that's a rundown of what I do. I would be happy to answer any questions, or I don't know if Marian had something she wanted to add, but yeah.
Yeah, I just hearing you speak about this. Well, I've even just in the decriminalization component at the end about, community alternatives, I was thinking a lot about our conversations at NARAL around the criminalization of pregnancy and how, a woman goes to her doctor's appointment, and then if there's any evidence of substance use, then she's therefore funneled into this criminal justice system rather than public health response. And I feel like a lot of that has come up in what you've been talking about, as well as I think in one of our previous conversations, I'm also very interested in kind of this stigma around mental illness that isn't around the physical disabilities. And I think I had asked you before, like, well, what about, violations of, physical access in prisons? And I think, you could speak a little bit more about this as well, but I remember you said, well, yes, that happens, but it's so much more difficult to kind of prove or uncover mental health violations because it's so much more subjective than kind of like, yes, this wheelchair does not fit in this space. Like that's, perhaps more straightforward to argue. And I think around like mental health or kind of more of those less visible conditions, it feels like a lot more difficult to prove or to gain like backing around, because people can make a number of different arguments around them.
Right. So it's the really like the core issue of most of our arguments with the department and the providers that they have is like there's really no factual dispute when we're arguing about an issue, right? Is we're just arguing about what's the cause of it, right? Our argument consistently is whatever we're the dispute is about is due to the underlying mental illness and failure of the department to mitigate that risk of harm with any sort of meaningful services or adequate medication. Okay. Whereas the department is saying that it's a behavioral issue, right? And this population, right, we're working with an incarcerated population. So unfortunately, they just do not receive that same benefit of the doubt that folks would receive on the outside, which, even on the outside isn't great, frankly, right? When you get into a he said, she said with law enforcement, but particularly so on the inside, that credibility is damaged, I guess. So there's this pervasive sense that when you're reading through these records after an incident, for example, where someone may be like cutting themselves or smearing feces on their door, something that when I hear it, I'm like, wow, that person is not well. Let's see if we can get them the care that they need. But then when I'm reading the records, talking about the incident and how it was documented on the prison's end of things, I'm seeing things like manipulative. I'm seeing things like was trying to get attention, stuff like that. And I like, we do deal with a lot of issues with physical disabilities. I don't want to make it seem like 100% of our work is on the mental side, because like Marian said, that certainly is an issue and one that needs to be addressed. And I do think DPSCS needs to do more on, right? In terms of getting folks wheelchairs, accessible cells, showers, grab bars, things of that nature. But as Marian mentioned, it's, I can see when someone is not able to walk, right? It's visible that someone is sleeping on the floor because they don't have grab bars to get themselves up onto the bed. It's evident when someone is skipping showers for 3 weeks because they know that slipping in the shower is a real and serious risk. Yeah, I don't want to like say objective or subjective, right? Because again, I think that the mental health stuff is objective as well. But I guess there's there's more visibility around physical issues. So a lot of our, especially systemic advocacy, does revolve around the mental health side, because I think that's where those strict in writing restrictions are needed, right? I mean, we obviously have the ADA, which we can use to request accommodation for mental or physical disabilities. But stuff like restrictive housing and attributing behavior to certain causes, I think needs more stringent protections, right? Because what we have now is clearly not getting the job done. So what we've seen in other states is, legislators making those protections explicit, and with great results, as I mentioned. So it's what we would like to see Maryland do is not some sort of revolutionary first in the nation type deal. In fact, Maryland is lagging, is in the bottom half, and I guess top half in terms of their use of restrictive housing, and needs to change.
Do you find that like the role of implicit bias is like very evident in this discussion in Maryland?
Absolutely, I think so, and that of course ties to stigma of folks with disabilities, but also again with folks who are incarcerated, right? Um, the stigma is like, oh, they're locked up. It must be like a bad person, right? And then you look it up, and it's it's something relatively minor, right? Or even if it is major, right? The person still maintains their rights. The ADA doesn't say that you only get reasonable accommodations if you're a good person, right? So I think that it's important to remember that we fancy ourselves to be a progressive, sophisticated country, that's that treats our citizens well, right? And no matter what the crime may be, folks are sentenced to a term of incarceration. That just being in prison and removed from your friends, family, and your community is the punishment, right? Treating someone like an animal on top of that is not what the sentence is, right? The person maintains their human dignity. They maintain all of their constitutional rights, um, and I think that is the fight that we're fighting basically.
Yeah, I also think even just your mention of the reasonable accommodations, I think we often have this like sense that accommodations are something extra and not like the very basic like basis to have access to something. And I think a lot of times people also don't, many of the people probably experiencing a mental health crisis or maybe even a physical access issue, if they have never been told that they have a right to have reasonable accommodations, then they're never going to even know that that's available to them.
Yeah, so that's another unfortunately very common problem is folks don't even know. So I mean, it's like part of one of my standard questions in a first interview or conversation is, have you requested a reasonable accommodation? And it's like very disheartening that a very common answer I get is, what's a reasonable accommodation, right? So the ADA requires every facility to have an ADA coordinator, right? Someone who's in charge of receiving these complaints, in charge of education, in charge of implementing the accommodations, et cetera, right? And what we've seen is every facility is just naming the assistant warden as the ADA coordinator, just by default. No sort of training, no sort of duties, no, they're not doing anything, right? It's just like on paper, the AW is 100% of the time going to be the ADA coordinator. Um, and they're certainly not doing any education, right? They've got posters up for everything, right? But there's no sort of written materials or distribution of materials, explaining what the ADA is and how to put in a request, which is really simple. I mean, legally speaking, a reasonable accommodation request literally just needs to like establish that the person has a disability, make the ask, and like direct it to the correct person, which is the ADA coordinator. It has to be in writing. That's Other than that, it's very vague. You can be creative with how you're crafting it. But that's just the folks who are incarcerated. Before I knew that every AW was the ADA coordinator when I was first starting out, I was calling each of these facilities to ask who the ADA coordinator was. And Marian, this was a process, okay? I'm bouncing around from case manager to case manager, some who don't even know that they're required to have one, right? I think one facility would said straight up no to me when I asked if they had one. And my follow up was, well, are you sure? Because I think that the law requires you to have one. And all of a sudden, there's backpedaling. Oh, I'm sure we do. I'm sure we do. And 2 days later, I get an email telling me that it's the AW, right? So, not just for the folks incarcerated, for the administrators and the staff themselves, I think education is extremely lacking, and that just is a reflection of their priorities, right? if this was something important, I shouldn't even say important, right? If it was something that they even respected as a thing that's real, I think that there would be a more evident, education campaign and more of an effort to make sure that this stuff is being implemented.
Before we kind of move on to the Q&A section, I guess just one last framing or kind of action for people who are maybe hearing about this for the first time, or who are interested in what decriminalization means but are not sure how to get involved. I know we talked a little about community alternatives and education. Like, what would you recommend as like action steps?
Well, like I said, I think a lot of the efforts right now in terms of the general public is making sure that you're calling your legislators, both in the House and the Senate, and making sure that they're aware of this issue, right? I'm not aware of any specific legislation that is up for this session dealing with this issue, but I'm certainly in touch with Diana, and she is certainly plugged in as well. And if and when those bills, are filed, whether it's this session or in the future, just making sure that your representatives are aware of this and don't see it as a throwaway item, because unfortunately, because of that stigma that I've mentioned and talked about, legislators themselves, tend to deprioritize issues around prison conditions. Really, the only way to get prison stuff passed is to frame it as a community safety issue, because that's what will get their attention. So yeah, just making sure that you're getting in touch, emailing, calling, and making sure that they know that their constituents care about this.
Great. Do we want to, I don't know if Diana wants to say anything, or if we want to open up for a Q&A, or for any of us to kind of start that?
I just wanted to say a few things. Munib's an amazing advocate. It's one of the reasons why we honored him last year at our annual chocolate gala for one of the Choice Advocates of the Year. So we so appreciate all his efforts and his passion about this work. So with our organization, we convened a coalition called Reproductive Justice Inside. And in 2018, we passed the first law in the United States saying that there had to be written policies established by every facility for pregnancy-related health care. And that if you have a positive pregnancy test, you shall be handed that written policy. And in 2019, we were the first in the nation to ban solitary confinement of pregnant people. So going into this session, we're reintroducing a bill that actually was in play last session, but we ran out of time. They adjourned 19 days early because of the pandemic. But this is assessing high-risk pregnancies once somebody is inside, and making sure that there's adequate case management upon release. So when they go back in their communities, they have everything set up. Health insurance, which providers are going to, pregnancy-related health care, mental health, HIV status, treatment, as well as anything to do with substance use disorder. And we're really hoping that people will listen to us, because of COVID-19, we've been trying to press people to get more pregnant people in and out of detention and incarcerated spaces as quickly as possible, so they're not sitting ducks to this virus. Because we still don't know how it impacts pregnancy and infants that they might have. It just doesn't look good. And we really want them to not be in these spaces. So it makes sense that there's going to be some kind of case management for these people to have the healthy pregnancy outcomes that they deserve, no matter what they decide to do with that pregnancy. So I just wanted to let everybody know what's going on, and that we're in the middle of implementing all the good work that we've been doing. And thanks to allies like Munib and other organizations, that we're just going to try to still press Department of Corrections to do the right thing. And not just because in our state prisons or in our county jails, our local detention centers used for ICE, but also our juvenile facilities. So thank you. So I think Q&A right now would be awesome. What kind of questions do people have?
Hi, this is Kit. I guess, let me see if I can take off my, hi.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm still working in bed, so I haven't really gotten out yet. So I'm on the board of Maryland NARAL. I'm on the C3 board, and but I live down in Silver Spring, and I'm involved with a coalition called the Silver Spring Justice Coalition. And one of the things that we've been doing is promoting the idea to our local county council to ask that police not be responsive to psychiatric crises. And we're trying to follow the CAHOOTS method. Are you familiar with that? The one that they use in Oregon?
I
Yeah,
am. We're huge fans of Cahoots.
yeah.
We love them.
Yeah, so I mean, if you have any additional information for us, that would be really helpful because even though the county council is really on board already with the idea of pursuing this for all the reasons that we would want them to, obviously Montgomery County is pretty progressive. But if you have any other ideas about what was useful in your advocacy work, be happy to see it. And I know Diana can put us in contact with each other.
Yeah, so first of all, I would say to please just connect with me offline, and I send over some written materials that could be helpful.
Great.
But really, I think that unfortunately, right, a lot of the arguments that we have to make are reframing this issue, right, making it about cost savings, right, making it about community safety. These tend to be the arguments that are most salient in our experience, at least. Um, but the good news is there's a lot of data behind that, right? It's a lot of science backing that up, which I'd be happy to share with you what we have. There may be some overlap, but there might be some new stuff in there too.
Yeah, and one other thing is that I was just meeting last night with a coalition around the ACLU and policing issues. And since NARAL has a commitment to reproductive justice writ large, there is an effort, which I don't know if all of you are aware of, to try and get rid of the uh, LEOBOR, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which basically, says that they can do anything they want and it's going to be handled internally. So there's actually a really big effort right now, and we're going down through all of the people who are in the State House to see what kind of support we can do. We also have the Maryland, oh shoot, what's it called? Uh, eh, MIPA. Anyway, it's for like having more transparency about what's going on with the police. And then there's also a reframing of the use of force. So all of these things obviously have a lot to do, especially with disabled people, because the reason that my coalition got started was that people who are having psychiatric crises, who also happen to be people of color, were then suspect because they put their hand in their pocket. And that seemed like there must be a gun there. So then they were shot. So these are the kinds of things that we are highly involved in. And it would be great to have even more connection with you guys. I think you're doing great work.
Thank you. And the one thing I would note in response is first of all, DRM is supportive of efforts to repeal the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, and what the ACLU is doing. But there's also a parallel Bill of Rights for correctional officers,
Oh,
which is pretty much the same thing.
what's that one
So
called?
it's COBRA, right? It's just the acronym, but with correctional officer instead of law enforcement. Um, but it's pretty much the same thing, right?
Okay.
Which grants correctional officers basically heightened protections which wouldn't exist for anyone else out in the community. Of course, we're very supportive of doing it for cops and the regular law enforcement one, but we're also supportive of efforts to repeal the COBRA as well, because since it's identical, I think the same arguments exist. It's just that the populations being policed are different, right? The folks out in the community are the ones suffering at the hands of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, whereas it's folks who are incarcerated for COBRA. So I think it's a less sympathetic group, which is why my theory is that folks have tried to stay away from repealing that, but it's the same argument. So that's something we would like to see as well.
And it's almost more of a human rights issue because it is so hidden and people think, well, they must deserve it. If all of the things that you were describing, I knew some of those things happened. I did not know that all of those things were happening, like being kept in restraints for 4 hours after you calm down. That's ridiculous. And so I think that the people who are most vulnerable is really where we as activists have to stand up. So I'm very pleased to hear that you guys are doing that.
Agreed wholeheartedly. Looking forward to connecting offline.
Yeah, I'm going to go back offline. Thanks.
And then with Disability Rights Maryland, we're also members of the Coalition to Reform School Discipline. And so there's also movement in counties like Montgomery County to remove school resource officers from our schools. So that way youth behavior is not criminalized, because that's a huge school to prison pipeline issue.
Yeah, we're also working on that too.
Great.
That's a harder nut though. That's a much harder nut because a lot of parents in areas that are not quite so wealthy feel like that really is a protection, sadly.
Any other questions that folks have? While people are thinking about their Q&A, Marian, is there any other points, takeaways that you want folks to really think about?
Yeah, thank you, Diana. I think that you had Dr. Sufrin here maybe last week or something.
Oh, Dr. Carolyn Suffren, yeah,
Sufrin,
from Johns
yeah.
Hopkins University,
Yeah.
was with us a few weeks ago on a webinar about pregnancy in incarcerated spaces. Yes.
Yeah, I just saw this. I think it was an article, a research article this year around how mass incarceration and the prison systems are kind of direct infringements of reproductive justice. And I just see a lot of those overlaps with this discussion around disability of, well, specifically kind of the criminalization of like social issues and kind of systems of oppression that, criminalization of poverty, criminalization of drug use, criminalization of mental health issues, and then the principles of, a right to have children, right not to have children, and parent those children, and just thinking about how both for folks suffering mental health violations in prisons, limited healthcare access, isolation, the harms of isolation for pregnant and parenting folks in prison, and just both of these issues of reproductive rights and justice and disability rights, both as human rights issues, and even more so when it's, disabled pregnant women, but even just these two vulnerable groups already. I don't even like necessarily saying vulnerable, because as Munib was talking about, it is the system that is creating this vulnerability. It's not their inherent personhood that is vulnerable in the first place. But yeah, I think just everything about for both pregnancy and disability of like public health and social services responses, rather than like immediate criminalization, when really centering like what are the basic needs and rights of these people.
Well said.
Munib, do you have any closing remarks you want to give?
That's a good way to end. I think Marian nailed it. Stuck the landing.
Well, that's what we strive for in our internship program. So great. Did anybody have any last questions or comments that you wanted to offer before we adjourn? Nope.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who came today, especially Munib, who has been very supportive and given his time, not just today, but multiple other times, to talk about my school interests, my internship interests. And I just really appreciate his time and expertise in this area. And it's really obviously making a big impact, and also personal impact in my own interests and kind of career development. So I'm really grateful to Diana and Isabel for giving me this opportunity for this webinar today.
Excellent. Okay, well, folks, we're going to close, and we're not going to have a webinar next Wednesday because it's Thanksgiving week. We're not too sure if we have anything for December 2nd, but December 9th, it looks like we're looking at juvenile justice, and December 16th, another RJI one about the bill that we're introducing about continuity of care for pregnant incarcerated people. And thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You have a great day.